They thought the fire would end me. I stood there, frozen, as my children tossed my journals, thousands of pages filled with my life's work, into the flames. The crackle of paper, the smell of burning ink, the sound of their laughter, it seared deeper than the fire itself. They believed they had erased my legacy, silenced my name, and stripped me of everything I had built. But what they didn't know was that fire doesn't only destroy, it forges. And from those ashes, I began the revenge that would turn their bright futures into nothing but smoke. The night it happened still burns in my memory more fiercely than the flames themselves. I was sitting in my study, the familiar scent of old paper and ink comforting me as I reviewed a passage I had written years ago. Suddenly the door burst open, and my children stormed in, their faces cold. Their eyes filled not with love but with something crueler, contempt. Before I could even rise from my chair, they began snatching journals from the shelves. "Dad, this nonsense is worthless," my eldest sneered. My heart pounded as I reached out, begging them to stop. But they ignored me. They dragged my life's work, 30, 40 years of research, into the living room, tossing it like garbage onto the floor. I tried to stop them, but one of them shoved me back into the chair, muttering, "It's time you let go of the past. Nobody cares about your scribbles anymore." Then came the strike of the match, the hiss, the spark, the sudden rush of orange swallowing the black ink. The smell was suffocating, burning glue, melting leather covers, the acrid smoke of knowledge being erased. My eyes stung, not only from the smoke but from the betrayal. My children stood there laughing, saying they were freeing themselves from the shadow of my work. I wanted to scream, to strike, to drag the books from the flames with my bare hands. But I didn't. I sat, silent, every crackle of the fire etching itself into me like scars. They thought my silence meant defeat. What they didn't understand was that silence is only the sound of revenge sharpening its edge. Tell me something, and be honest. What would you do if the people you raised, the ones you sacrificed everything for, stood over a fire and laughed while your life's work turned to ash? Would you forgive them? Would you walk away? Or would you wait, patient and silent, for the day they finally paid the price? I'll tell you what I chose. But before I do, I want to hear from you. Leave your thoughts in the comments, because maybe I'm not the only one who's been betrayed by the very people they trusted most. And if you believe knowledge should never be destroyed, if you think no father should be forced to watch his children mock his life's purpose, then show me I'm not alone. Hit that like button. It may seem like a small gesture, but it tells me you understand that what they did was unforgivable. Oh, and subscribe, because the story you're hearing now, it's just one of many. Stories they hoped I would never tell. Stories they wish could have burned with those books. Now, let me take you back before the fire, before the betrayal, to where it all began. When people see an old man hunched over his desk, scribbling in notebooks, they think it's nothing more than a hobby, some way of passing the time before death comes tapping. They don't see the decades behind each line, the sacrifices made, the sleepless nights spent chasing one stubborn idea. My journals were not a pastime. They were my soul pressed into paper. And long before my children threw them into the fire, I knew exactly what they meant to me. I was not born into privilege. My father worked with his hands, a mechanic who came home smelling of oil and iron, and my mother stitched clothes late into the night to keep food on the table. Yet even as a boy, I craved something different. While others played in the dirt roads of our small town, I spent hours in the library, the smell of old wood and paper filling my lungs like air I couldn't live without. I remember one librarian in particular, Mrs. Klein. She was a stern woman with glasses that always slid down her nose. But she had a soft spot for me. She would slip me books far beyond my years, treatises on history, science, philosophy. I devoured them, and in the margins of cheap notebooks I bought with saved coins, I began to write my own thoughts. Half-formed theories, questions no one around me seemed to ask. Those notebooks became the first sparks of a lifelong fire. When I grew older, I pursued knowledge as though it were oxygen. University, research, teaching. Every step was a fight, but I fought with joy. My peers went home to families or to pubs. I went back to my desk, pouring myself into writing. Each notebook I filled wasn't just for me. It was for the generations that came after. A man leaves behind land or money or a house. I would leave behind thought, the purest inheritance of all. But here's the irony. The very people I wanted to inherit my legacy, my children, were the ones who came to despise it. At first, it was subtle. When they were small, they'd tug at my sleeve while I scribbled, asking, "Daddy, why are you always writing?" I'd smile, close the journal, and tell them I was making a map of the world they'd someday walk through. They didn't understand then, but I thought in time they would. As the years passed, their questions turned into complaints. "You care more about your books than about us. Why can't you be like other fathers?" They saw my journals as walls keeping me from them. They didn't see the truth, that every page I filled was for them, an attempt to give them something greater than material comfort. Still, I tried to balance both worlds. I attended their recitals, their graduations, even as my mind hummed with unsolved theories waiting for me at home. I told myself they'd forgive me one day when they saw the value of my work. But value to them was always measured in money, not meaning. When their friends' fathers retired with fat pensions and golf memberships, they looked at me with resentment. "What do we have?" my son once spat. "A pile of dusty notebooks?" That night, I stayed up rereading the lines I had written decades earlier, words I once thought immortal. And for the first time, I wondered if perhaps they were right, if my journals really were just stacks of forgotten paper. Then came the betrayal that cracked the first fault line. One afternoon, I discovered my eldest had taken one of my journals to school, presenting my work as his own in a competition. He won. I remember the smugness in his grin when he came home with the trophy. "See, Dad, I finally did something useful with your rambling." I should have confronted him then. I should have laid down the law, made it clear that those pages were sacred. But I stayed silent. I told myself it was a childish mistake, born of immaturity. But silence is dangerous. It tells people you will tolerate what should never be tolerated. Over time, the small cracks became chasms. They stopped asking me about my work altogether. Instead, they mocked it. At family dinners, my daughter would roll her eyes and say, "Dad's scribbling another useless theory." They laughed, clinking glasses, while I stared at the plate in front of me. Each laugh was a knife, but I swallowed it down. I told myself they didn't mean it. That bitterness was temporary. That maybe, in time, they'd grow to see my journals for what they were. The story of a man's life, etched in ink. But envy does not soften. It hardens. It calcifies in the heart, turning even blood ties into chains of resentment. My children grew older, chasing careers in shiny offices, parading titles I had never cared for. They measured success in money, cars, status, and the more they measured, the more they saw me as a relic. One evening, my daughter visited with her husband. As we drank tea, she looked at me and said, "Dad, you should stop writing. It's embarrassing." The word hit harder than a slap. Embarrassing. That's what my life had become to her. I smiled weakly, excused myself, and went back to my study. I opened one of my oldest journals, pages yellowed and brittle, and read the first line I had ever written as a boy. "Knowledge is a flame. If you keep it alive, it will light the world. If you let it die, the world stays dark." I closed the book and whispered to myself, "I will not let it die." But I had no idea then how far my children were willing to go to kill it themselves. The first time my work was mocked, I told myself it was just their immaturity. Children rebel, I thought. They need to carve their own space in the world. But by the time they were adults, I realized it wasn't rebellion. It was contempt. And contempt, when left unchecked, poisons everything it touches. My children had grown into ambitious, sharp-tongued professionals. They wore suits, drove shiny cars, and spoke in clipped tones about bottom lines and deliverables. Their lives orbited around quarterly bonuses and polished reputations. And in their eyes, I was little more than a fossil from another age. At first, the distance was subtle. Missed phone calls, excuses to avoid dinners, a sense that my presence was a burden rather than a joy. But then came the open mockery. One Christmas, as we sat around the table, I gifted them something precious. Bound copies of a few selected journals, carefully printed and wrapped in simple brown paper. I thought perhaps, if they held my words in their hands, they'd finally see the value in them. My son tore open the wrapping, glanced at the leather cover, and burst into laughter. "Dad, are you serious? More of your scribbles. Couldn't you just give us money like normal parents?" The table erupted with chuckles. Even my daughter smirked, though she tried to hide it. I sat there, heart pounding, feeling the flush of humiliation spread across my cheeks. I had given them a gift from my soul, and they treated it as though I had handed them trash. That night, after they left, I stayed awake in my study. I stared at the shelves lined with notebooks, hundreds of them, and for the first time in decades, I considered locking them away where no one could ever touch them again. They weren't ready to inherit my work. Perhaps they never would be. But even as I locked the study door, I made another choice. I began digitizing my journals. Quietly, patiently, one page at a time, I bought a scanner, taught myself the software, and created backups on hidden drives. If my children refused to see my life's work as valuable, I would ensure that others did. Someday. Still, I clung to hope. I thought perhaps they'd come around with age, but I underestimated how greed festers when it's mixed with insecurity. One evening I overheard a conversation I was never meant to hear. My daughter was in the kitchen speaking on the phone, her voice low but sharp. "Yes, I know Dad's work. That's why I'm asking. If I can get access to it, maybe I could repackage some of it, put my name on it. No one will know. He's too old. No one takes him seriously anymore." The words sliced into me like knives. She didn't just mock my work. She wanted to steal it, erase me, and pass my thoughts off as her own. I clenched my fists in the shadows of the hallway, forcing myself to stay silent. Confronting her then would have given away too much. Instead, I went back to my study and redoubled my digitizing efforts. If they wanted to rob me, they'd be walking into a trap, but their schemes escalated. My son, ever the opportunist, began taking photos of my journals when I wasn't around. I discovered the evidence one morning. Faint smudges on the edge of a page where his careless fingers had pressed too hard, and the faint smell of his cologne lingering in the room. He wasn't just mocking me anymore. He was mining me. I began noticing their subtle attempts to control me. They'd suggest I downsize the house, sell off my library, make life easier. At first, I thought it was concern. But then I realized they weren't planning to preserve my legacy. They were planning to dismantle it, piece by piece, until nothing remained. The final straw came the day my daughter brought her husband to visit. He was a slick man with a polished smile, always eager to flaunt his shallow wisdom. As we sat in the living room, he gestured toward my shelves and said, "You know, you could make a lot of money shredding those old books and selling the space instead. These things are just clutter." I looked him in the eye and said nothing, but inside something shifted. I realized my children weren't ashamed of my work because it had no value. They were ashamed because deep down they knew it had too much value, and none of it belonged to them. Not long after, their actions confirmed my suspicion. I returned home one afternoon to find several shelves stripped bare. Journals missing. My stomach dropped as I tore through the house searching. Finally, I found them in the garage, stuffed into boxes, labeled in my son's handwriting, to sell. That night, I confronted him. "These are not yours," I said, my voice trembling with a mixture of rage and heartbreak. He smirked, leaning against the doorframe. "Neither is the house, Dad. Everything you have will be ours eventually. Why wait?" I wanted to strike him. My hand shook as I clenched it into a fist, but I didn't. Violence would have given him what he wanted, proof that I was the senile, angry old man he told people I was. So I stayed quiet. I took the journals back into my study, locked the door, and made a vow. Never again would I let them so much as touch a single page. But I was wrong, because silence doesn't always protect you. Sometimes it emboldens those who believe they've already won. Weeks later came the night that sealed my fate, and theirs. I emerged from my room to the smell of smoke, thick and acrid, curling under the crack of the door. My heart raced as I stumbled into the living room, and there they were, my children, my own flesh and blood, laughing as they tossed journals into the flames, each page curled and blackened. My life's work reduced to ashes while they mocked me. My daughter sneered, "Finally, no more of Dad's embarrassing scribbles." I wanted to collapse. I wanted to throw myself into the fire to save them. But I stood there, frozen, watching decades of my life vanish in smoke. My throat burned with the smoke, but even more with betrayal. And as I stood there, silent and still, one thought formed in my mind, sharp and clear. If they wanted fire, I would give them fire. Not one that destroyed me, but one that would consume them instead. The fire should have broken me. That was their plan. They wanted me stripped of my history, emptied of my pride, reduced to nothing but an old man with no proof of the life he lived. They thought once the journals were gone, I'd wither quietly in my chair and fade into irrelevance. But what they didn't know was that long before the fire, I had already begun building something they could not touch. Every night, while they mocked me for being too old to use technology, I had been scanning my journals, page by page. Every note, every sketch, every idea, preserved in hidden drives, encrypted and backed up in places they could never reach. So as I stood there, choking on smoke, watching them destroy the physical shells of my work, my despair was already hardening into resolve. The books were gone, yes, but the knowledge? That was alive. And knowledge, when wielded properly, can be sharper than any blade. Still, their attack had left me cornered. They weren't satisfied with fire alone. The following weeks revealed just how far they were willing to go. At a family dinner shortly after the burning, my son leaned across the table, smiling that smug smile I had come to know too well. "Dad, you don't have to keep living alone. Why don't you sell the house, move into a retirement place? We can handle everything for you, everything." I heard the hunger in his voice, the greed beneath the feigned concern. He didn't want to take care of me. He wanted to take control of the house, the land, the remnants of my possessions. My daughter chimed in sweetly. "It would be better for you, Dad. Safer. Besides, you don't need all that space anymore." I stayed silent, letting their words hang in the air like smoke. They mistook my silence for weakness. But what I was really doing was taking notes, not in journals this time, but in my mind. Every sly remark, every veiled threat, every attempt to box me into irrelevance was fuel for the fire I was preparing. It wasn't only property they wanted. Soon, whispers began reaching me from colleagues and acquaintances. A former student of mine called one afternoon, his voice hesitant. "Sir, I saw something online. I thought you should know." He sent me a link. There it was, bold and shameless, an article published under my daughter's name. The words were mine, lifted almost verbatim from one of the journals I had digitized but never shared. My theories, my phrasing, my work, stolen, dressed in her name like a mask. My hands shook as I scrolled through it. Rage burned in my chest, but deeper than rage was heartbreak. To see my own child parade my life's work as her creation. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than fire ever could. Worse still, she was gaining recognition. Academic circles praised her for groundbreaking insights. Conferences sent invitations. Funding offers poured in. She basked in the spotlight, smiling on panels, never once acknowledging the true source of her brilliance. And then came the day my son joined her. Together they launched a consultancy firm, branding themselves as visionaries. Their website boasted of original frameworks and unique methodologies, all stolen from my journals. I watched as their careers flourished, built on the ashes of the fire they had lit. And with each success they flaunted. The noose of betrayal tightened around me. But revenge is not taken in haste. No, revenge is crafted, like a patient sculptor chiseling marble. And so I played my role. I attended family gatherings, nodding as they boasted of their accomplishments. I let them sneer, let them treat me like a relic. All the while I worked in silence. First I gathered evidence. I compared their published work with my digitized journals, lining up paragraph after paragraph, timestamp after timestamp. The matches were undeniable. I created folders, files, carefully organized trails of proof. But proof alone wasn't enough. I knew their arrogance would shield them. If I simply accused them, they'd dismiss me as a bitter old man jealous of their success. No, I needed to bide my time until their reputations were so inflated, so dependent on my stolen work, that one pinprick of truth would collapse it all. The complication was, of course, trust. Who would believe me over them? They were young, polished, admired. I was old, quiet, invisible in the eyes of society. So I turned invisibility into my weapon. Through an old colleague, I made contact with a network of young researchers hungry for knowledge but disillusioned with the establishment. They respected me not as a has-been but as a mentor. To them, I shared glimpses of my digitized archives, ideas, theories, frameworks, all under one condition, that they never reveal the source until I allowed it. Slowly, quietly, my ideas began spreading again, but this time under the radar, flowing through hands that valued them. Meanwhile, my children kept climbing. My son boasted about securing high-profile contracts. My daughter flashed her name on published papers, her face on magazine covers. They became darlings of the academic and corporate world. The higher they rose, the more precarious their fall would be. And fall, I promised myself, they would. The strain, however, was not easy to bear. At night I lay awake, my mind torn between sorrow and rage. I remembered the little hands that once tugged at my sleeve, the small voices that once called me Daddy. How had those children grown into thieves? Into arsonists of legacy? There were moments when doubt gnawed at me. Was I being cruel for planning their ruin? Was I still a father, or had I become something darker? But then I would recall the fire, the smell of burning ink, the sound of their laughter as my journals turned to ash. And I would know they had already destroyed the bond between us. What remained now was justice. One evening, as I prepared more evidence, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My face was lined, my hair thinning, my back bent. An old man, yes, but in my eyes burned something that age could not dim. Resolve. They think they've won, I whispered to my reflection. But they've only written the first chapter. The ending will be mine. I thought I had seen the worst of their cruelty the night my books burned. I believed nothing they could do afterward would surprise me. But arrogance is a fire that feeds on its own smoke, and my children's arrogance had only just begun to choke me. The more they built their lives on my work, the bolder they became. Invitations flowed in for lectures, conferences, interviews. They smiled in photographs, their names printed in bold beneath headlines calling them thought leaders and visionaries. I watched from the shadows as they strutted across stages, words I had written decades ago tumbling from their mouths, as though they were revelations discovered in the shower that morning. The applause was deafening. Cameras flashed, and in every cheer I heard the same thing, erasure. They weren't just taking my words. They were taking my place in history. At first I told myself to wait, to be patient. Their pride would make them sloppy. But then they crossed a line I could not ignore. It began with an email. A prestigious university, the same one where I had once taught, announced a new endowed chair position, awarded to my daughter for her groundbreaking contributions to the field. Groundbreaking. My heart clenched as I read the press release. The very theories she was being honored for were word for word from a journal I had written in 1983. I remembered the night I had drafted those lines. The rain tapping against the window, the smell of strong black coffee, the rush of clarity as the idea took shape. That moment had been mine, and now it was hers. But the insult didn't end there. My son had leveraged her recognition to expand their consultancy into an international firm. Corporations paid obscene amounts for strategies lifted directly from my work. Together they presented themselves as pioneers, claiming to have reshaped the landscape of knowledge. And yet, they could not resist rubbing salt into the wound. One evening they invited me to dinner at a sleek new restaurant. I almost refused, but something told me to go. Perhaps it was instinct. Perhaps it was curiosity. We sat at a polished marble table. My daughter wore a designer dress, her husband a smug grin. My son scrolled through his phone, showing off headlines about their firm's latest success. At some point, my daughter leaned forward, her voice low enough that only I could hear. "You see, Dad? We were right. Your scribbles weren't worth anything until we touched them. We made them valuable. We made them real." Her words rang in my ears long after the dinner ended. It wasn't enough that they had stolen from me. They needed me to know they had stolen. They needed me to feel powerless. But powerlessness, when harnessed, becomes focus. And in that moment, my focus sharpened to a single point. I would not let them leave this world believing the lie they had built. Still, revenge is not easy. Complications swirled around me like storm clouds. For one, they controlled the narrative. To the outside world, they were the brilliant innovators. I was just an old man, rarely seen in public, increasingly painted by them as eccentric, even unstable. I overheard my son telling someone at a gathering, "Dad's not all there anymore. He thinks he invented everything." It's sad, really. Those words weren't casual. They were strategy. If I ever spoke out, he had already planted the seed of doubt, that I was delusional. Second, they had allies. Universities, corporations, colleagues who had bought into their success. To attack my children was to attack an entire ecosystem of power. If I moved too early, I'd be crushed under its weight. And then there was the complication of time. I was old. My hands trembled sometimes. My back ached. Nights stretched long with fatigue. Part of me wondered if I could really see this through, if I had the strength to outmaneuver two younger, sharper wolves. But each doubt was silenced by memory, the fire, the laughter, the smell of burning ink. That memory was enough to stiffen my spine. The turning point came during one of their international conferences. I watched the live broadcast from my modest living room. My daughter stood at the podium, presenting a theory I had drafted more than 30 years earlier. Behind her, projected on a massive screen, was a diagram I recognized immediately, because I had drawn it by hand in a notebook in 1979. But there was one mistake. In her arrogance, she had copied not just the brilliance, but the flaw. That particular diagram had contained a deliberate error, a placeholder I had marked to refine later. I had corrected it in subsequent journals, but she hadn't known that. She had stolen blindly, and there it was, displayed for the world, cheered by thousands. I laughed, the first real laugh I had allowed myself in months. Because in that era I saw the crack in their fortress. It would take patience. It would take strategy. But now I had the weapon I needed. I began laying the groundwork in silence, reaching out to old colleagues, whispering truths, planting seeds. I fed small, precise details to the right people, enough to spark questions without revealing my full hand. I worked late into the night, cataloging every timestamp, every draft, every correction. My digital archive became a fortress of evidence, impenetrable and undeniable. But the more I prepared, the more reckless my children became. Flush with power, they started cutting corners. They grew careless, plagiarizing not only from me but from others. They treated employees like disposable pawns, and whispers of discontent began to circulate in their circles. Their empire was growing, yes, but it was rotting at the core, and I was ready to be the hand that pushed it over. The final complication came when they tried, once again, to strip me of the last thing I had left, my independence. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail. Legal documents. My children were filing for power of attorney, claiming I was mentally unfit to handle my own affairs. That was their fatal mistake. In trying to erase me completely, they gave me the perfect narrative. No longer was this just about stolen ideas. It was about dignity, about an old man being silenced by those who should have protected him. And as I signed the letter refusing their claim, I whispered to myself, "You've played your last hand." Now it's my turn. They thought age was my weakness. They thought frailty meant surrender. But what my children never understood is that age can be an advantage, because by the time you've lived as long as I have, you've learned the art of waiting. And I had been waiting for this moment my entire life. When that letter arrived, their attempt to take power of attorney and declare me unfit, something inside me settled. Until then, my anger had been raw, scattered like smoke with no direction. But now it coalesced into something sharp, something solid. They wanted to erase me not only from history, but from the present. They wanted to strip me of autonomy, to make me a ghost while I was still alive. That was their final mistake. Because ghosts have nothing left to lose. The first step in my revenge was simple: organization. I gathered everything I had: the digitized journals, the timestamps, the metadata that proved when each file had been created. I cross-referenced it with their published articles, their speeches, their consultancy pitches, line after line, diagram after diagram, all traced back to me. Proof undeniable. I knew, however, that evidence alone wasn't enough. In this world, truth doesn't always win. Narratives do. And so, I began crafting mine. I reached out quietly to a handful of trusted colleagues, the few who still remembered me not as an old recluse, but as the man who once filled lecture halls. To them I presented glimpses of my archive, careful excerpts, enough to spark recognition. Their eyes widened as they compared my pages with the so-called innovations of my children. This is your work, one whispered. Yes, I replied, and they have paraded it as their own. The outrage in their voices was the validation I needed. But I didn't ask them to act, not yet. I asked them only to remember, to keep their eyes open, and to wait. The second step was distribution. My children had burned the physical copies of my journals, but they hadn't destroyed the essence. I uploaded portions of my digitized archive anonymously, slipping pieces into academic forums, open-access databases, even mailing snippets to younger researchers hungry for authentic ideas. My work began to spread like wildfire again, not under their names, but under no name at all. Pure, untethered knowledge. Meanwhile, I built redundancy. Multiple backups across continents, cloud accounts, encrypted drives tucked in safety deposit boxes. Even if I were to die, my work would outlive me, and theirs would crumble the moment my hand revealed the truth. But revenge is not just about exposure. It's about timing. I knew if I struck too early, they'd find a way to spin it. They'd call me senile, bitter, jealous. So I waited. I let them climb higher, let their names shine brighter, let them depend entirely on the pedestal they had built from my bones. And as I waited, I studied them. I attended their public talks, sitting quietly in the back, taking notes like an obedient student. They never noticed me. To them I was invisible, but I noticed everything. The phrases they repeated, the theories they hadn't bothered to understand fully, the cracks in their delivery. Once, during a seminar, my daughter presented one of my earliest models. She stumbled when asked a question about its deeper implications, something I had resolved decades ago. I sat there biting back a smile because I knew she was building a career on foundations she didn't truly understand. And one day that ignorance would expose her. My son was no better. He had turned my ideas into corporate jargon, selling diluted versions to executives too dazzled by buzzwords to see through the emptiness. He spoke in circles, a salesman in a suit. But the higher the fees he charged, the more enemies he made among competitors. I knew I wouldn't have to fight alone. Their arrogance was already sharpening knives behind their backs. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to hand those knives to the right people. But even in my patience, there were complications. Loneliness weighed heavy on me. Nights stretched long, filled with the ache of betrayal. Sometimes I'd wake in the dark, the image of burning books still vivid, the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears. Rage would surge in my chest, so strong I thought it might stop my heart. In those moments, I would rise from bed, walk to my desk, and open my archives. I would read my own words, words they had tried to destroy, and remind myself, you are not broken. You are not gone. They failed, and with each reread line, my resolve deepened. To sharpen my strategy, I consulted quietly with lawyers. Not directly, not in ways that would raise suspicion, but through hypothetical questions, carefully framed. I learned about intellectual property, about fraud, about the legal weight of timestamps and digital records. I discovered that while the world may not always honor truth, courts often honor proof, and proof was the one thing I had in abundance. The more I learned, the more I realized my revenge didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be a shout. It only needed to be precise. A scalpel, not a hammer. Still, I wanted more than legal victory. I wanted poetic justice. I wanted them to feel the humiliation I had felt, to watch their reputations burn just as they had burned my books. And so, I began weaving a trap. I fed them bait. Through an old acquaintance, I let slip rumors of unpublished works of mine, radical ideas I had never revealed. Predictably, my children pounced. Within weeks, I saw echoes of those ideas appearing in their talks, their papers, their consultancy pitches. They were so desperate to keep milking me that they didn't even pause to verify if the ideas were real. They were not. They were poisoned fruit, deliberately flawed theories, carefully constructed to collapse under scrutiny. And when they collapsed, I would be ready to show the world the real origin, the real correction, the real author. As the trap tightened, I found myself calmer than I had been in years. My hands no longer shook with helpless rage. My heart no longer raced with grief. Instead, I felt a cold clarity. They thought they had stripped me of everything: dignity, legacy, even sanity. But in truth, they had given me a gift. They had given me the motivation to turn my quiet knowledge into a weapon. And soon, that weapon would strike. I often think back to that night when my books turned to ash, when the laughter of my children rang louder than the crackle of the fire. They thought they had destroyed me in that moment. But what they didn't understand was that destruction can sometimes be the purest form of creation. They had burned the body of my work, yes, but they had also burned away my hesitation. All that was left was purpose, and so purpose became my companion. The bait I laid was already doing its work. Those poisoned theories I slipped into circulation found their way into my children's hands like moths to a flame. My daughter presented one at a symposium in Berlin. I watched the video recording later, my lips curling in a grim smile. She stood tall, commanding, but when a sharp young researcher challenged the logic of her model, she faltered. Her answer was vague, defensive. For the first time, doubt flickered across her carefully crafted image. That was just the beginning. Meanwhile, I prepared the more practical side of my plan. I consulted discreetly with a former student of mine, now a well-respected attorney. I never revealed the full truth at first. Instead, I asked about a hypothetical case. What if someone could prove their intellectual property had been stolen, documented with time-stamped journals and digital archives? Could a case like that stand in court? The answer was clear: yes. Especially if the theft had resulted in financial gain, reputational advantage, and fraudulent contracts. I leaned back in my chair as he spoke, my heart steady. For the first time, I knew I wasn't just a grieving old man with a pile of ashes. I was a man with a weapon sharpened by law, but law alone would not satisfy me. No, revenge required something more poetic. So I began laying a second snare: reputation. My children's empire rested on the illusion of originality. Strip that away and everything else would collapse. I prepared dossiers, detailed comparisons of their work and mine. Page by page, diagram by diagram, side by side. I added dates, context, and notes on every correction they had missed. It was tedious, exhausting work. My hands cramped. My eyes burned late into the night. But with each page I organized, my spirit grew lighter. I wasn't documenting my ruin anymore. I was documenting theirs. The final piece was timing. They had announced a grand unveiling, a new book co-authored, which they claimed would redefine the field. It was to be launched at a glittering conference in New York, with press, investors, and academics all watching. That, I decided, would be the stage for my counter-strike. Weeks turned into months as I tightened the trap. I worked with young researchers who had grown suspicious of my children's sudden brilliance. I shared with them carefully chosen pieces of my true archive, not enough to give away the full game, but enough to sow questions, enough to ignite whispers. Doesn't this look familiar? One would say. I think I've seen this before. Another would murmur. And so, before the conference even began, doubt was already spreading like smoke through their halls of influence. My children, blinded by arrogance, noticed nothing. They basked in the attention, announcing their book with fanfare, giving interviews filled with self-congratulation. They were too intoxicated by their own reflection to see the cracks forming beneath their feet. At home, I made my final preparations. I drafted a public statement, measured, factual, devastating. I compiled the evidence into a digital file, encrypted but ready to release with a single keystroke, and I arranged with my attorney to have legal motions filed the very morning of their book launch. Every detail mattered. Because revenge, if it is to be remembered, must be more than a strike. It must be a spectacle. But still, I wasn't finished. I wanted the world not only to see their theft, but to see it in contrast with the truth. So, alongside their unveiling, I prepared my own. I polished a manuscript, a compilation of my digitized journals, annotated and clarified, brought together into a single cohesive volume. Unlike theirs, mine was genuine. Unlike theirs, mine carried the fingerprints of decades of thought, not months of theft. I partnered with a small but respected publisher, one who knew my history and believed in my work. The deal was simple. Release my book the same week as theirs. 2 unveilings. One real, one stolen. One destined to stand, the other destined to crumble. On the eve of the conference, I sat in my study, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. The folders of evidence were neatly arranged, the statement drafted, the emails queued. For a long moment, I simply breathed. Decades of pain, sacrifice, betrayal, all funneling into this quiet moment of stillness. I whispered to myself, tomorrow, the fire burns again. But this time it will not be my books. This time, it will be their future. That night I slept better than I had in years. The morning arrived with a crisp chill. I rose early, dressed in a simple suit, and tucked a small USB drive into my pocket. Not because I needed it, but because symbolism matters. It was my insurance, my talisman, proof that I had survived the fire, proof that knowledge cannot be destroyed. As my children prepared to bask in their greatest triumph, I prepared to deliver their greatest humiliation. The morning of their book launch, I woke before dawn. The city outside was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air is holding its breath. I sat at my desk, laptop open, finger hovering over a single key. The files were ready, the comparisons, the timestamps, the corrections they had missed. Decades of work organized into a weapon sharper than any blade. My children were across the country in New York, preparing for their grand unveiling. A glossy venue, reporters, academics, investors, everyone who mattered in their world would be there. Cameras would flash, microphones would catch their every word, their names would glitter on banners and posters. It was their coronation, and I would turn it into their funeral. At 9 a.m. sharp, as the audience took their seats, I sent the first wave. An email blast, carefully targeted to academics, journalists, corporate contacts, and colleagues who had once respected me. Attached was the dossier, side-by-side comparisons of my journals and their original work. Paragraphs lined up perfectly, diagrams traced back to my hand decades earlier, mistakes they had parroted without understanding. Within minutes, whispers began to ripple through the crowd. Phones buzzed, screens lit up. My children, standing backstage, smiled for selfies, oblivious to the storm already gathering. By the time they walked out under the bright lights, the audience was no longer theirs. Some faces were skeptical, others downright hostile. And when my daughter began to speak, I saw it, the first flicker of unease in her eyes. She could sense it too. Something had shifted. She pressed on, presenting the book as if nothing was wrong. But then a hand shot up from the crowd. A young researcher stood holding up a tablet. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Can you explain why this passage in your book matches word for word a journal entry dated 1983, authored by—" He paused, savoring the silence. "Your own father?" Gasps. Heads turned. Cameras pivoted. My daughter froze, her polished smile cracking. Before she could respond, another hand rose. This time an older professor. "And this diagram here," he said, pointing to the screen behind her. "It contains an error corrected decades ago in private drafts. How is it that your published work reproduces the mistake, but not the correction?" The room buzzed like a hive disturbed. My son tried to step in, his voice firm. "These are baseless accusations. Our father is confused." But he never finished, because at that very moment, the second wave hit. My attorney, as arranged, filed official legal complaints in federal court, citing intellectual property theft, fraud, and misrepresentation. The filings were public, and the press had already received copies. Notifications pinged across journalists' phones. Social media exploded. Academic fraud, stolen ideas, burned but not forgotten. The hashtags began trending before my children could even stumble through their defense. I watched the live stream from my modest living room, the glow of the screen reflecting in my glasses. My heart was steady, my breath calm. I had imagined this moment for years, but the reality was sweeter than I could have dreamed. My daughter stammered, her voice cracking as she tried to explain. My son grew defensive, angry, shouting over the crowd. The audience, once applauding, now muttered in disgust. Some got up and left. Others snapped photos, videos, evidence of the collapse happening live before their eyes. The third wave was the final nail. At precisely noon, my own book was released online and in print. The collected works of grandfather's name, a lifetime of research. 1,000 pages of real thought, annotated with dates, notes, and insights. The preface, my own voice explaining the betrayal, the fire, the theft. Within hours it sold out in academic circles. Universities and corporations that had once courted my children now reached out to me, apologizing, begging for access to the original source. Their book, the one they had built their empire on, was dead on arrival. Mine became the standard overnight. By evening, news outlets were running the story. Acclaimed siblings, exposed for plagiarizing father's work. Photos of them smiling on stage were paired with headlines of disgrace. Commentators didn't spare them. They didn't just steal ideas, one anchor said. They tried to erase the very man who gave them life. The fallout was swift and merciless. Universities rescinded honors. Publishers pulled contracts. Clients canceled deals with their firm. Their names, once praised, were blacklisted. But the sweetest part wasn't the institutional punishment. It was the look in their eyes during that conference. The moment they realized they weren't untouchable. That the man they had mocked, the father they had tried to erase, had been quietly building the fire that would consume them. I received messages from people all over the world. Former students, colleagues, even strangers. Some wrote simply, "We believe you." Others said, "Thank you for standing up." And still others admitted, "We once thought you were forgotten, but now we see you were always the true source." I didn't need the praise, but I savored the irony. My children had wanted to burn me out of history. Instead, they had etched me into it more permanently than ever. In the days that followed, they tried to reach me. Emails, calls, pleas to meet. At first, I ignored them. Then finally, I wrote back a single sentence. "You burned my books. I burned your careers. We are even." I never heard from them again. In the quiet that followed, I often sat in my study, surrounded not by shelves of burned paper, but by screens and pages alive with words reborn. My children had tried to erase me, to reduce me to nothing more than ash and silence. Instead, they had carved my name deeper into history than I could have done alone. Their laughter by the fire had been their declaration of victory, but it became the echo of their downfall. People say revenge cannot heal. Perhaps that's true. But it can correct. It can balance the scales when the world tilts too far into injustice. My books were gone, but my knowledge lived on, stronger and louder than ever. And as for them, their names once celebrated now stand as warnings, because fire doesn't only consume. Sometimes it purifies, sometimes it reveals, and sometimes it remembers.